He realized that he would have to learn to blend in and not act so bizarrely. But even with learning to put on that mask, he was still the odd one. I mean, you can change the way you act, but people don't forget the way that you treat them. To be clear, at this point, they're in high school, and he was so far into the teachings of the Bible that when he would get invited out to parties and dancing and things like that, he would look down upon the other kids and tell them that what they were doing was sinful. So he ended up not really getting invited to parties that much either. Though he was trying to be more normal, he didn't quit preaching. See, the people in the town of Lynn would no longer listen to him, and so he would instead go over to the city of Richmond, where he worked part-time at a hospital, and would preach to literally anybody on the streets that would listen to him while he was dressed in really nice clothes. And some people did indeed listen to him. He would particularly go back to an area that was predominantly an African American residential and industrial area. A boy in this area, like him, stood out quite a bit between his natural appearance as well as the way he presented himself. He stood out like a sore thumb. Once he would get about 4 or 5 people listening to him, he would go over to this lamppost and grab a blanket, lay the blanket out, and inside the blanket was a Bible. Now, this Bible, he used it more like a prop, talking both about God and the importance of equality in the people while raising the Bible over his head. He would state that he felt like there needed to be something said about poverty, and particularly about the issues regarding race, seeing how people of color back then were forced to be in one area. He stressed the need for brotherhood for all and tied the message to the written word of God. See, he knew the right words to say. And because of this, everybody just started flocking to him, and the numbers of 4 to 5 ended up growing to 20, 30 people just lining up on the streets. Then in his junior year of school, he would end up having to move over to Richmond. Lynetta finally had enough of Jim's father, and the two of them ended up separating, and she was going to live with her new boyfriend over in Richmond, who he was also a divorcee. Though this was the reason for them moving, Jim was very embarrassed about the whole situation, so when he explained to Dawn that he was moving, he instead told Dawn that he was moving to Richmond because Richmond had a far superior curriculum compared to the town of Lynn. At the time that Jim told Dawn about this, the two of them really hadn't had any sort of communication with each other, and Dawn was feeling really bad about the fight that happened and how the two of them hadn't really made amends. So as the good guy that Dawn is, he ended up going over to Jim's house and just having one final sort of hangout session. Jim seemed really excited to see Dawn. The two of them went back into the kitchen and ate sandwiches together. And as they were eating, they're just kind of catching up on what was going on in their lives and such. And Jim ended up mentioning about how Dawn had purchased a motorcycle. Now, Dawn already knew about how Jim was very disapproving of his motorcycle. In fact, the whole town knew about how Jim did not like the fact that Dawn had a Harley. Jim stated to Dawn that he was mostly worried about Dawn's safety because of how dangerous motorcycles can be, and told him that he would appreciate it if he could get a ride to Richmond if Dawn was ever headed that way. The two of them would continue to talk until the sunset, and Dawn kept trying to get up to leave, but then Jim kept persuading Dawn to stay longer, stay longer, stay longer. And Dawn kept continuing to stay longer, but then finally Dawn firmly told him that he had to leave and do chores before dark. Stay a bit, Jim insisted. Dawn hesitated again, but then decided that it was time for him to go. So he walked out the kitchen, out the living rooms, briefly saying goodbye to Jim's father, and then proceeded to go out the porch and was heading towards the sidewalk. Jim followed behind Don as Don went out the door. Don turned around to see that Jim was standing in the doorframe and his hand was hanging down, clasping his father's pistol. Jim spoke in an ominous tone. "I don't want you to go." Don insisted that he really needed to leave. And Jim said, "Just stop or I'll shoot you." Don had never heard Jim talk like this to him before. And he told him, "I'm going home." And he continued to walk down the sidewalk and down the tree line. And Jim picked up his pistol, took aim, and shot at Don, barely missing him. Instead, he ended up hitting the tree that was next to Don. And Don was shocked by all this. His ears started ringing and he ran and ducked behind a bush for safety. Through the leaves, Don could still see Jim standing there with the gun hanging by his side. Now, this actually wasn't the first time something like this happened. Yes, it may have been the first time he spoke to Don in this kind of tone, but it wasn't the first time that something involving a gun happened between him and Don. When they were younger, the two of them were hanging out in the barn, just laying there with their shirts off one hot summer day. And for some reason, Jim would end up taking his BB gun, pointing it at Don's chest, and shooting it in his chest. And it was strong enough that it did cause Don to bleed. Then when Don was like, "What was that for?" Jim said that he just wanted to see if Don could handle it. A few months later, the two of them would end up going rabbit hunting together, and Jim was carrying a rifle. Now, as he was carrying the rifle, he kept kind of pointing the rifle at Don's feet, and Don asked him to stop pointing it in his direction. And instead of Jim being like, "Oh yeah, I'm not going to point it in your direction," no, instead he goes, "I've been thinking about demanding you stop walking." When Don asked what he meant by that, Jim literally said that if Don took one more step, that he'd shoot him. Then shot Don's shoe, barely missing Don's foot. Yeah, it makes more sense why they drifted ways, doesn't it? Like, he was doing all of this before even graduating high school. Now, back in Richmond, Jim had set his eyes on a very pretty young nurse that worked at the hospital. She had light red curls and looked like she belonged in a movie. She was a very gentle and warm person and just had a way of making everybody feel welcome and accepted. She came from a really good, solid home where literally everything revolved around family and the church. She sang in the choir and she played piano, and though she was a very soft person, she also wasn't afraid to speak up for herself and the things that she believed in. But something that was both beautiful and definitely ended up being a huge problem later on is that she was way too trusting, to the point of being very naive when it came to others. She always believed in the good in people and that people were good on their word. Outside of work and school and everything, she was really a homebody. She would prefer to be with her family or focus on her studies or her music rather than going out or partying or anything like that, so she didn't really have a whole lot of social experience outside of her family and her church. She took her life very seriously, and though she struggled with arthritis, she would get mostly B's, but her ambitions were really strong. Her grades were enough, though, she was able to be admitted to a university. Instead of letting her parents carry the financial burden, she opted instead to go to a nursing school that was federally funded through a World War II program. She saw doing this as a way to help people, and with her first check, she would buy clothing for a fatherless family of 8, and then would also buy a coat for her own mother. She didn't want to be with a man that would just make her a housewife while he would pursue career in college. Like, she wanted to be equal to whatever man that she ended up with. And Jim Jones, he also caught her eye. She spoke to a friend about this young orderly that helped her with this pregnant woman who passed away of trichinosis. She stated that the young man showed so much compassion and empathy over the situation, and he was very visibly upset over seeing the young woman pass, and he spoke about his worry for her family and the loss of her life and things like that. And it was very different to her compared to the way a lot of other men would respond to this kind of situation. Showing this vulnerability is definitely what caused Marceline to start falling for him. Over time, they got closer and closer, and eventually they started dating. Now, the character that Jim presented to Marceline, to her, was a breath of fresh air. He was unlike the other men that she had known. He was well educated, he was compassionate, he loved humanity, and he spoke about equality for people and his love of people and how he wanted to end suffering and poverty. Like, he seemed to be a genuine soul with a heart of gold to her. Here is a man that spoke so much truth and honesty of helping others, who spoke of social issues and world events. He seems so intelligent and well-rounded, yet kind. I mean, being shown this kind of character, how could she not admire him? Little did she know that a lot of his stories were just a trick to get her to like him. And he would tell her lie after lie to win her favor. One of these stories in particular was how he told her that back in his little town of Lynn, that he was a basketball star, and that he ended up quitting his team after the coach was saying a bunch of racial slurs about some opponents that they were facing. As we know, Jim didn't like to get dirty. He didn't like sports. The only sport he ever did was cross country. She, of course, had no reason to not believe him. All of his research, his life experience leading up to this point, definitely taught him well. His confidence, theatrical ability, and imagination sold whatever it was his mind would come up with. He no longer had the small town of Lynn that knew who he really was. Now, his tall tales were no longer considered to be tall tales. Instead of disgust and isolation, he found admiration. He could finally be whatever he wanted to be. And he was more focused on the medical world and humanitarianism rather than preaching. And the mass that he showed Marceline, it really seemed like a blessed dream to her. Like she had met her prince, a white knight in shining armor. She was really a believer that this man was meant for greatness, and that together they possessed the power to serve mankind, to heal and to help. Even her friends liked Jim. particularly her friend Evelyn, who worked at the hospital with them. She would often speak to Jim, and she agreed that he seemed very kind and like a great guy. She would even join them when they would go on walks together, and he didn't seem jealous or possessive in any way. He really seemed like he was giving all the green flags. Really, to everyone in the hospital, he seemed like a pleasant, charming, educated young man. He was even popular amongst the patients. After he had been working there for 2 years, he presented himself as being higher than what he actually was. He would wear a white lab coat just like the doctors did. He considered possibly pursuing a career in hospital administration. He could see himself running a place where people would be healed, and this could definitely satisfy his needs for leadership and order and admiration, yet be something that his mom would definitely prefer over him doing the whole preaching thing. Then one day, remember Jim's old buddy Don? Well, he ended up showing up at the hospital. He got a job there. Now, Don, understandably, wanted to keep his distance from Jim after the whole shooting incident, but Don really needed the money. He was also told that there was a lot of pretty single nurses, and so he ended up applying, and he assumed that he would be an orderly just like Jim and that they would more so be co-workers and he wouldn't really have to deal with him. But boy, was he wrong. Jim once again became extremely dominant over Don and started bossing him around more like a boss-employee type of situation, even though he wasn't actually Don's boss. He was going around telling Don what to do just like they did when they were kids, and making Don do all the dirty work while Jim just sat back and watched just like they did with the animals. Don resented this, and he would tell his parents back home how he felt, but then when he'd go back to the hospital, because of Jim's status in the hospital, having worked there for as long as he had at this point, he really didn't have any sort of power to get anything done, because when he would try to get up, it's, oh, Jim, he's not like that. He's a good guy. So he didn't really feel like he had any power to really get anything done about it. He was this newcomer from this little town who was essentially up against the golden child of the hospital. He would take this treatment in silence, but one thing that did make it better was the nurses. Don went out with a few nurses about the same time that Jim was really getting to know Marceline, and he would tell Don that he was also taking out 3 to 5 nurses, but then as far as Jim has said in other things, Marceline was the only one, so I don't know. Jim had such a reputation with the nurses that he actually would get them to help him pull pranks, particularly on his buddy Don, to try to make Don's life miserable. He would pull quite a few pranks on Don over the time that Don was at the facility, but the final one that Don just could not take it anymore and called it quits was after Jim blocked the door to the autopsy room and had Don clean up every bloody tool and every bit of flesh in the entire room. After this, he left, and that was the last that him and Jim Jones ever saw of each other. Marceline and Jim, though, were getting way more serious about each other. And she learned something that Jim actually hadn't told her before, even though they had known each other for all this time. And that was the fact that he was 4 years younger than her and just starting his senior year in high school. She was shocked, understandably. And I mean, he looked and acted way more mature than he actually was. The part about being in high school, he quickly changed. He graduated with honors and decided to move to Indiana University midterm, leaving his mom's apartment and going out on his own. With this move, he did also end up quitting his job as an orderly at the hospital. Marceline introduced her new beau to her parents at her graduation from nursing school. And needless to say, they were very concerned about his age, and they were also concerned at the way that he was courting her. To them, it seemed like his gestures were pretty aggressive in a sense. But the way I'm gonna describe it is the guy was totally love bombing her. He was calling her all the time. He was sending her tons of gifts all the time, making these grand gestures. And to a girl that's not really used to all this, yeah, it can seem very flattering. And with parents that have been around the block a little bit, I can definitely see where it would be concerning. But with him being so young, they kind of chalked it up to just, puppy love. Over the next few visits, after getting to know the family, Jim ended up kind of growing on them. He was very respectful, yet he would still let his opinions be heard, but he was careful about it. They liked the fact that he was interested in the church and that he was so active in the church. However, he did not mention what churches that he was a part of, and he definitely didn't say anything about being associated with the church of the people who spoke in tongues. The family invited Jim to their place for Christmas, and Jim, when he got there, he was dazzled by the sight of the Christmas tree. It was adorned in so many decorations and Christmas lights, and he told them it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. But then as he was admiring it, a sadness creeped over him, and he confessed that his family, they never had Christmas trees. Jim mentally started comparing Marceline's family to his family, and Marceline's family, in comparison, was very well off. And Jim, he was intimidated. Now, her family decided to make a more formal introduction of Jim to the family and invited Jim and other relatives all together to do so. This time, though, Jim was way different. You know how usually he's very polished, proper, has his hair all in the right place, always wears really nice clothes and things along that line? Well, rather than wearing his normal attire, he shows up in his scrungiest outfit and just had a nasty attitude from the get-go. To him, he saw her family as being uppity and he was inferior, but he judged them horribly wrong. See, yeah, they seemed way better off than his family was, but the truth is, they were just a normal, middle-class, hardworking family, not the snobby rich like he kind of made them out to be. Despite Jim acting like a jerk, the Baldwins looked past all that, and Marceline, she even apologized for the way that Jim was behaving, but her family was like, oh, what do you mean? He wasn't acting weird at all. All right, let's go back to Jim's time at the university. So when Jim got to the university, he ended up getting really sick from the typhoid shot. And he ended up sprawling himself out on the lower bunk, and he was clammy, he had chills. Dude was not doing well. Well, his roommate, Ken Lemons, comes in, and the bottom bunk was Ken's bunk. And he's like, yo, what are you doing on my bed? And Jim is like, I'm too sick to move, which, I mean, he was sick. But Ken, seeing how rough Jim was doing, he's like, I'll just let him have the bottom bunk for right now. But then over the next few hours, Jim stated that he'd never be able to leave the lower bunk because he had a horrible fear of heights. To be clear, Jim did not have a fear of heights. He was just, once again, manipulating someone into doing what he wanted, and yeah. Ken fell for it. He ended up giving him the bottom bunk because he believed that Jim had this, fear. As a student and peer, Jim once again found himself to be a outsider and a loner. I mean, he was a 16-year-old small town boy starting amongst a group of mainly war veterans, and a lot of these people that had grown up together, people that were from wealthy families, and pretty much all the guys spent their time out of school going to burger joints, chasing after girls, and drinking. And Jim, he wasn't about that. In fact, he looked down upon their immaturity and sinful lifestyle. Instead of giving it a chance to get close and make new friends, he once again withdrew and just went into himself. Initially, the other students figured that this guy must be some sort of kid genius because, I mean, he's 16 and he's going to university. But at this point, his study habits were horrible. At least when it came to studying the things he was actually supposed to be learning in the university, he would spend more time trying to study his own personal philosophy and reading more books along that line instead of actually focusing on his education. And he would get really offended when his ideas were challenged. His roommate, Ken in particular, actually had been attending the Disciples of Christ churches all his life and found Jim's religious views and knowledge of scripture full of holes. He started picking it apart and found that Jim would often bend the Bible to fit his own unorthodox views. No matter how wrong he may be, he dominated conversations and was intolerant of his roommate's ideas. Ken wouldn't keep it just to Christianity either. He would talk about Hinduism, Judaism, and tons of other religions, but Jones seemed completely blind to sophisticated points of theology. Ken couldn't believe that somebody like this would be dating someone like Marceline. Jim Jones, he kept a picture of Marceline on his dresser. And Ken found out about her being older, and not only were they dating, but they were actually planned on getting married during the summer. When he wasn't at the university, he would escape over to Richmond to see his beloved Marceline. He would grab a bus, and sometimes she would drive him back. Then when they were apart, they'd have really long, affectionate phone conversations. And the relationship itself was really odd because she acted both like, not only like a partner, but almost like a mom to Jim Jones. The two of them planned their wedding, planned their lives together, and even established a joint bank account where she was the one that was supporting him financially. Jim spoke really highly of Marceline to everyone, and he was very respectful when it came to talking about her. Though Jim and Ken would have verbal debates about religion and study habits, overall things were really fine with the two. That was until one odd night, Ken was just sleeping in his bed, and then all of a sudden he felt this sharp pain in his back. And at first, he thought that a wire just popped out of his mattress, which, I mean, understandable, right? But then all of a sudden, there was another sharp pain. And this time he looks underneath his bed, and there's Jim with a long hat pin poking it in and out of Ken's mattress. Understandably, Ken's like, "What in the heck is wrong with you?" And he leaps to the floor and then runs and tells the people on staff what happened. Now, I'm not sure what happened after that, but just another example of Jim and his craziness. Jim and Marceline end up getting married on June 12th of 1949. It was a combined ceremony with Marceline's sister, and the whole church filled to capacity with people, including the mayor and city council members. Marceline moved with Jim over to Indiana, where they got their first house together across the street from the hospital that she would work at, yet still close to the campus that Jim was attending. And Jim, though he was still pursuing his education, he did look for a part-time job to help financially support the two of them, since Marceline was still the breadwinner. See, she would work nights in surgery at the hospital, but then she would also take courses at the university while supporting the two of them. She felt that all this sacrifice was more than worth it, since she believed that he was really going to make a mark on the world, thinking that he would probably be either a hospital administrator or a lawyer, but either way, she knew that it would go along with helping the disadvantaged, and that was something she really cared about, since it was a vision the two of them shared. Jim knew that Marceline still needed to be close to her family, so he would make the 100-mile drive all the way back for her to see her family as often as he could. When they would arrive at his in-laws' house, he would burst in the door and be like, "Grandma, Sharon, I'll take you to the movies tonight." And then they would all go out on the town together and have a lot of fun. Now, Sharon, she is Marceline's youngest sister. And Jim and Sharon definitely had a special relationship. He treated her like a little sister. And then Marceline, she was the oldest. And she kind of saw her little sister almost as a child of her own and treated her as such. Jim would tell little Sharon stories of what was happening in the world and what was wrong with it. How minorities were mistreated and how a lot of the churches were contributing to the problem with their segregated congregations. Oddly enough, when nobody was around, not even his wife, he would sing to her "It Ain't Necessarily So" by George Gershwin, especially the line, "The things you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so." If you look up the song and pay attention to the lyrics, it's very much an atheistic song. One of the parts that particularly stood out to me after looking up the song is, "They tell all your children, the devil, he's a villain. It ain't necessarily so." And this seemed to be one of Jim Jones's favorite songs. Odd considering how he was about the Bible, isn't it? Once the honeymoon stage ran out, the relationship that once felt so heavenly to Marceline, it took a turn for the worst. Jim all of a sudden dropped his Methodist views that he stated to share with Marceline and started expressing his atheistic views. Marceline, she clung to her faith that was so important to her, that was so ingrained in her family and her identity. And the way that he spoke to her about all this, it hurt her deeply because he was cruel to her about this. And he refused to be silent on this subject. He could not let his wife nurture her religious delusions. And he got so hard on her about this that he even threatened to take his own life if she continued to pray. He felt that it was his duty to prove to her that he had found that there was no God. That he knew from hospital experiences, that he knew from seeing the poor in the streets, that no merciful God will allow for such suffering. And he put her down for how she believed, because she wanted to believe in her faith. She wanted to believe in all this, and he went along with it until he had her trapped. And him making the threats on his life, that deeply troubled her. But because they loved each other so much, and, well, she loved him, she was willing to bend and forgive him. Their religious conflict ended up getting kind of pushed to the side most of the time, but granted, they were being pulled in so many directions and were barely seeing each other, between both of them working, both of them going to university, and on top of that, money being scarce, didn't really have all that much time to argue amongst each other. Despite them living very simply, they ended up having to move and get a trailer across town. Then, when the in-laws came, it was clear that something had changed in Jim. He had this new antagonistic tone towards them. And his ideas seemed to completely change. It was like she married one person, but then the person that she was with was a completely different man. At least one occasion, he made sympathetic statements about communism during the Korean War and how it was ridiculous that people treated communism like a disease. Later, he would claim that he'd been a communist since he was a child. The way he spoke freaked out little Sharon so much that she was scared that the FBI might start banging at the door any moment just because of her brother-in-law's views. Then, another time, after the family had been visiting for a few hours, the Baldwins, they ended up going out to their car to find that the car wouldn't start. And when the repairman came out, he said that he was certain that somebody had tampered with the engine. And something in their gut just told them that Jim did it, but they couldn't prove it. And then this thought also became further validated later along the line as other odd incidents just kept happening. And then on top of this, his treatment towards Marceline just kept getting worse and worse. One day, he was reading the newspaper and just casually spoke to Marceline about how there was this horrible car accident, right? And as he's listing off those that died, he just casually names off one of her most dear friends. And Marceline just stops in a state of shock and falls to the floor in grief, just screaming and crying, and just fell apart grieving for her friend and speaking of her love for her. And Jim, he's just sitting there all stoic, watching her go through all this. And then after she has just completely lost it, he just goes, "Oh, I was just kidding." This poor girl was so blinded by love that she shrugged off the cruelty and was like, "Oh, that's just how he jokes," and she would just try to laugh it off. And he wanted her all to himself now. Friends, family, they were now rivals to him. Even though he was so accepting of them in the beginning and would invite them and try to have her so close to them, now all of a sudden it was a problem because they took her attention. They took her love. He couldn't have that. He had this constant need to test others' loyalty, including doing so sadistically, especially with his own wife. Was it his insecurity or was it something more sinister? He enjoyed watching people suffer to prove their love for him, to beg for his attention. Now, Don, he definitely got glimpses of the evil that hid behind that mask. Now, Marceline was also now a victim to the monster that Jim hid from the world, and for the longest time hid from her too. She struggled because she still saw the man that she fell in love with, the one that was kind and gentle and intelligent. This behavior that Jim had, she blamed it on his age because, they're there was an age gap between the two of them. So she figured that it was probably just him, turning into a man, and eventually this would all pass over. He would still show her that side of himself too. Like, it wasn't like he was always a monster to her. He would go back and forth between being the character that he created to make her fall in love with him, and then go to the monster. Then go to the charming man. Then go to the monster, keeping her hooked. He made her believe that she was signing up for a life that was completely different than the life that she actually ended up signing for. See, she was signing up for a life with a kind, generous man that she would someday be having children with and raising a family much like her parents did. But he gave her no signs or reason to believe up until this time that he was anything but good. In 1950, an opportunity would arise that would show Marceline the classic Jim that she fell in love with. Her cousin Ronnie Baldwin, his father ended up dying, and his mom wasn't in the best capacity to take care of him. So he ended up in a foster home. He got really sick, and they went to go see him. It turned out to be really bad, and so they took him to the hospital. It turned out the kid's appendix had ruptured, and if they hadn't have been there, he wouldn't have made it. So after they saved his life, he ended up coming home with them and became their first kid, essentially. He was their first foster kid. It was a good time for him to move in with them because Jim had just completed his third semester at the university and shifted from just doing business to wanting to go more to social services and was considering law. They ended up moving over to Indianapolis to continue Jim's studies at the Indianapolis University and enter law school as an undergraduate. Really, though, Jim did everything but study during this time. And Ronnie, his time with them was a whirlwind. He was only with them for about 15 months, and soon you'll understand why. Ronnie went with Jim through different jobs, different ventures, and was out with Jim pretty much every night on outings. And Jim, he was really lost in his direction and trying to search for something in his life, feeling like higher education just wasn't the answer for him anymore. They had gotten an apartment, but didn't have the apartment very long because Jim's habit of collecting animals, it didn't stop. He continued collecting quite a bit of pets. One of those animals included a chimpanzee that mysteriously died of poisoning. And that would be the first of a long string of just random things dying suspiciously around Jim of poisoning. And needless to say, the extra animals and having to move, it created more financial strain, which meant Jim had to work more jobs. At this point in their relationship, Marceline was really wanting to start a family with Jim, but Jim insisted that she really needed to work instead. So he ended up getting her a typewriter and taught her to type so she could get a job as the school nurse. Though they both worked a ton, they didn't neglect Ronnie. They made sure that he had everything he needed, and they treated him as their own. He even called them mom and dad, at least for a while. In the beginning, though, they had him on vitamins to help him with his growth. They bought him a dog, a bicycle, nice clothes, and even paid for tap dancing lessons. This is while Jim Jones had holes in his shoes, and Marceline, she only had one uniform that she would wash every single night. In return for the efforts that they were putting into Ronnie, they expected the best from him. They wanted him to get above average grades and would punish him if he did wrong, as, I mean, most parents do. Jim kind of demanded himself, though, as being Ronnie's father, and the way that Jim went about this made Ronnie very wary. Since Jim didn't really have much of a role model in the dad department, he ended up kind of taking on more of a leadership role rather than a companion or a parent. And he tried indoctrinating the kid by giving him books to read and trying to convert him to his own wild beliefs. And before you know it, that poor kid became a victim to Jim's sick games. And if you have issues when it comes to anything to do with kids, skip this part. One of the pets that Jim had was a monkey. And this monkey, Ronnie was scared of. See, Jim taught this thing to attack on command. And once or twice, he let out a really odd noise and then pointed to Ronnie. After making the sound, the monkey, he charged after the boy and ran him up on top of the bathtub to escape the monkey. And the monkey bayed Ronnie up there while Jim was just laughing about the whole thing. Marceline ended up having to be the one to tell them to stop. And this whole ordeal, it didn't sit right with her. These episodes would pass quickly. He would be cruel one moment, but then saintly the next, showing the utmost compassion on serious subjects. Then the next moment, be a mischievous villain under the guise of playful banter. The family, they rarely stayed home when they weren't working. They would get in the car and cruise around the city, talking, people watching. Jim took Ronnie along to the movies and to political lectures that he attended. In the summer, they all went on vacation. And it was their first one to Indian Lake Resort in Ohio. One of these days, Marceline stayed behind in the cottage. Jim took Ronnie out on a boat, stopping in the middle of the lake to swim. While Ronnie was in the water, Jim restarted the motor on the boat. This poor kid, he is clinging to the side of the boat while Jim is dragging him in circles. "Let go," Jim said. Ronnie refused, terrified that the blades would end up getting him. Jim continued just circling while trying to get Ronnie to let go. Luckily, a lake patrol officer spotted them. And that lake patrol officer was not having it. He ripped him a new one for endangering that poor boy. I really wish that he would have pressed charges or something on him, but granted, I don't know what the laws were like back then. But either way, that could have ended so badly. And he was just a kid. The next vacation they went on, there was another incident. This time, the three of them were wandering along the river about a quarter of a mile above Niagara Falls. And Jim told Ronnie to wade in the strong current, promising that he would hold on to him. And Ronnie, he was terrified. He didn't want to do it. He got to the point of breaking down in tears because Jim just kept egging him on, telling him, "You need to do it, you need to do it, you need to do it." And Marceline, she didn't intervene. Finally, Ronnie gave in. Jim did hold on to him at least. On their way back from this trip, or after they got back from this trip, I'm not too sure, they had something happen that would completely change the trajectory of their life. See, Marceline, Though it was hard for her to argue Jim's criticisms, she finally convinced him to come to a Methodist church with her. On the bulletin board outside read a document that spoke of the goals that the church so happened to align with what Jim and Marceline supported. It addressed ending poverty, a form of security for the aged, prison reforms, free speech, jobs for all. And what stood out the most to Jim in the decade before the Civil Rights Movement? There read, "We stand for the rights of racial groups." He knew that collective action would be the only way he could get things changed to the way he wanted them to be. He knew he was meant to lead and not to follow. But up until now, the right opportunity hadn't come along. Marceline announced that Jim was entering the ministry during Ronnie's tap dance recital. The entire family was there, and they were shocked, especially with Jim's behavior. They expected anything but that. It was through the ministry that he could finally utilize his talents. He was finally able to fulfill his own personal needs to lead the people. This was finally the place that he could excel. And 2 months later, he ended up accepting an apprenticeship position as a student pastor at Somerset Methodist Church. This church was in a predominantly poor area. He continued his education at Indiana University, but taking more occasional classes instead of it being a full focus in his life. They moved again, this time to be closer to the church. His first sermon, he spoke of moral lessons from the Bible. Now, instead of rejecting his college roommates' ideas, he embraced them, using them to attract people from various faiths and backgrounds. Ronnie started to get known as the preacher's son. Marceline and Jim, they wanted to make it official with adoption. But Ronnie, when they presented him with this option, instead of being excited, he was terrified, understandably. I mean, dude basically tried to him. Jim, in his manipulative ways, tried to convince the boy that he had nowhere else to go, even going as far as to telling the poor kid that his mother was a horrible person and didn't support or love him. Yeah, he went there. That did not go over well. And in September, Ronnie ended up attending one of his brother's weddings where he saw his mother there and found out that his mother did love him and she was now in a place that she could support him if he wanted to come back. Ronnie realized that Jim had been lying. And Jim still tried to get Ronnie to sign the adoption papers. And Ronnie refused. Jim argued and threatened. Marceline did not agree with the way that Jim was behaving, and she was scared that they were going to lose Ronnie. And that night, it was rough on Ronnie. There's not a whole lot of details on it, but it said that it was the roughest he had to deal with at the hands of Jim's wrath. And that morning, he would board a plane and not come back. In the reunions that followed this ordeal, the mere sight of Jim would send the kid running for the hills, hopping over obstacles and fences just to escape even being in Jim's sight. And though the kid made it very clear how he felt about Jim, Jim would still try to pressure him into coming back. This persistence was yet another characteristic that, had it been in the hands of someone that was actually good, could have done good with it, but in the wrong hands, toxic and deadly. This persistence and his way of hot and cold is what kept Marceline in his trap. But she really did consider leaving him the first few years that they were together. Everything had become too much for her, but she didn't dare confide in her family. The marriage wasn't the life that she signed up for. Not even close. She wanted a partnership. Instead, she was being treated as if she were below him. She wanted children and didn't necessarily want to sell her life away, working herself tirelessly. She was torn. She loved Jim. But knowing the psychology of this, she loved the idea of who he pretended to be. She cherished her individuality, yet it was being torn away from her bit by bit. She was losing her identity, who she was. She didn't realize it at the time, but Jim, he was intentionally tearing her apart. The things that he loved about her, he was breaking her down and taking pleasure in doing so. See, people like Jim Jones, and Jim Jones in particular, they don't fall in love or go after people that necessarily fall at their feet right away. It's this sort of sick game that they play where they'll find somebody that is very unique, very different, a lot of times very, very independent, very driven, very sure of themselves. They'll take someone that's bright, lovely, individualistic, make them glow with their love bombing, give them the world, make them feel like they finally achieved their happily ever after. Then when they least expect it, they rip that rug out from under them. And next thing they know, their entire world is just upside down. And that beautiful flower, it starts to wither away, just like Marceline started to. Divorce at that time was heavily stigmatized. Marriage was taken very seriously and was seen as a lifelong commitment. She felt like, maybe it's worth suffering a little bit longer. I mean, she saw a little bit of a silver lining considering that Jim had just taken a liking to the ministry, which was a huge part of her identity. And she helped him with campaigns, helped him with a $20,000 fundraiser for a recreation center for children of all faiths. This, he got featured in the local papers. And he would continue to be featured in the papers for a lot of the good deeds that he would do. His biggest focus, though, was on desegregation, and because of this, he started to look more towards the Pentecostalists, since it would draw a lot bigger crowds because of their healings and emotional services. But really, he just wanted the attention. He just wanted the admiration. He wanted the big crowds. His true need was to not only be loved, but to be admired and fawned over by the masses. He started studying these healings closely. Everything had to be perfect in order for him to convince people that he was actually healing them. And he was trying to figure out how he was going to do that. He was at a loss on how to do this until he ended up going to a convention over in Columbus, Indiana, where there a little old lady would introduce him to the congregation along with a prophecy. I perceive you are a prophet and will go around the world, and tonight you begin your ministry. That whole prophecy thing definitely did not help with the delusions of grandeur. When he first hit the stage, he was overwhelmed with nerves. Then, like a flick of the switch, all of a sudden, something changed. And next thing you know, words just start pouring out of him. He called on people and they just soaked it up. They loved it. They loved him. He brought them close and he touched them. And to Marceline's amazement, they would fall down praising Jesus. The energy of the crowd felt like it shook the building. To her, this was confirmation that the man that she loved was blessed by God. And she forced her feelings and concerns out of the way about the way that she was being treated. Just let those go into the dark. She felt it was her duty to do anything he wished. I know it was long. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to focus on Marceline, he ended up treating her definitely the worst out of everybody. And to go from being someone that he once, he borderline worshipped her. And then he turned from borderline worshiping her and acting like she was the best thing to ever happen to him, to treating her like she was dirt. Seeing these things, seeing the way that he treated people from such a young age, says a lot to what he would inevitably end up doing later down the line. And there was a lot more that happened leading up to Guyana. I'm not just stopping at Marceline. We are going to be going into how he rose to fame in the ministry, how it was that he came to Redwood Valley, and what happened in Redwood Valley and San Francisco, why it was that he hightailed it to Guyana. And then I will end up going into what happened while they were at Guyana and the after effects of it. The whole story is just devastating. Often I feel we think that people like Jim Jones are not that common. And yeah, I wouldn't say they're super common, but think about how he would portray himself as this saintly, amazing person, and then shift back to being this horrible person and do the back and forth. The older he got, the more power he got. And with more power he got, the more he was able to do even worse, horrendous things. Until next time, I really hope that you have a wonderful time. And be careful out there, okay?